Good evening, everyone. My name is John Furniss, and I'd like to thank you for joining us here tonight. I must say you are all looking wonderful. It's kind of hard to see all the way to the back, though, with that spotlight in my face. So, just so there's no confusion, I am 100% blind, but only in my eyes. And I am here tonight to share with you how I've used my other senses and my previous experiences to adapt to becoming blind. I became blind when I was 16 years old, and I attempted suicide by shooting myself. And through divine intervention, luck, or pure chance, I only lost my sight and sense of smell, and my mind was left completely intact. And leading up to this, for a few years, I had really been having a hard time finding my place and fitting in, and everything in my own mind, everything was this big monumental occurrence, and every event in my life had such significance put on it. But really, when it comes down to it, it was just the life of a teenager, which I admit can feel like both the beginning and end of the world. But there you go. And so for several years, these feelings built, and I tried to hide them, and finally it came to a head, and I did what I did. And a piece of advice I would give to teenagers is don't take yourself so seriously. You might feel like an adult, but really you're still kind of a kid. And feel free to be silly and just for kicks and do something just like a kid again. Honestly, 300 years ago, it would be considered a midlife crisis, but we got a lot more time ahead of us these days. I adapted to becoming blind very quickly. For instance, 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital, I changed the rear wheel bearings in my old car by myself. And I was able to do this because I had helped my father change some wheel bearings when I was about 8 years old, and I remembered all the tools and techniques and was able to do it without any problem at all. And that went a long way towards helping me cope with my blindness. I also used humor to help cope. At the same time, I used humor to hide from it and try not to accept it. I also used drugs to try and cope and hide from it as well. That sounds kind of crazy, hiding from something as fundamental and all-encompassing as total blindness, but you'd be amazed the things that we'll do to convince ourselves of something we either do or do not want to admit. And of course, this was a recipe for disaster. It pretty much describes the first year after I became blind. And eventually, my parents decided to put me into some intense counseling to help things out. When I graduated from high school, I made another brilliantly terrible decision and moved back to the little town that I grew up in. And I ended up on drugs 10 times worse than I was before. I got in trouble with the law and ended up on probation. Since most of my money was going to my drug habit, I was living in some pretty shabby boarding houses. One of them, when I was growing up, I thought the building was abandoned. It was so run down, and as a matter of fact, it was condemned about 12 years ago. One other thing that had happened is when I shot myself, all the sinuses in my forehead were destroyed, which also destroyed the natural drainage path. And that ended up causing me to have a sinus infection that was so bad, I had to have emergency surgery on my head to remove the abscess. To make a long story short, the first hospital I went to botched the job in spectacular fashion. Not only did they not get rid of the infection, they gave me another one on top of it. And when the infection recurred, it infected the bone in my forehead so much, it had to be removed and eventually replaced with a prosthetic plate. This was another time that I most certainly was watched over because the doctors that did the surgeries, it was a team of them, and they're very highly respected. They told me that most of the other people that they had seen with a sinus infection of that magnitude they didn't survive the infection. And the few that they saw that did were severely, permanently brain damaged. And so I was definitely watched over. And to make a bad situation a little bit worse, I had to go without bone or prosthetic plate in my forehead for over a year while I could heal to the point where I could accept the plate. Also, when I got back to my boarding house, someone I know had stolen my stereo and my X-Acto knife set I used for sculpting clay, the only two things I had of any value whatsoever. And I have to admit, talking about this has definitely stirred up some powerful feelings, but it reminds me of a joke from one of my favorite comedians, Kyle Kinane. It's like looking around in your mind and saying, "Oh, what's that over there? Oh no, it's nightmares!" and don't worry, there is light at the end of this tunnel, and here's where we can start to see the glimmer. I decided to humble myself and reach out to my parents for the help that had always been there and will always be there. But I had ignored it because I wanted to continue my rebellious and self-destructive ways. And of course, they took me in, and through their love and support and my own rock-hard stubbornness, I was able to quit meth and to get off probation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. About that time, I started attending fine woodworking classes at a local school for the blind there in Salt Lake City. I kind of thought they were crazy at first, having a wood shop in a blind school. But I've always been interested in that kind of thing, and I've always been adventurous, so I decided to give it a try. And when I started that class, I found my calling. I found a skill and gift for woodwork that I just don't have in any other aspect of my life. And it was a very wonderful experience to be able to find that. And for quite a while, I had been having trouble finding employment because I'm not your average blind person in that I don't really have computer skills. I'm a hands-on type of guy. I like to fix things and build things and make things. So I had heard of the Emil Fries School of Piano Technology for the Blind that used to be here in Vancouver, and I thought that sounded like a perfect fit. So in fall of 2010, I came up for a 3-day trial period to see if I would be accepted to the school. And the only way I can describe the way I felt when I got here to Vancouver is my soul is home. There is a magic here that just speaks to me like nowhere else. And luckily, I was accepted to the course. And in February of 2011, I came up here and started school. And in July of 2012, I walked into one of the classrooms where I was repairing a piano, and there just happened to be a local artist there who was painting a piano for a fundraiser. And of course, the very first thing I did was put my hand in the wet paint on the piano. It's like a magnet. I don't know how to explain it. Of course, we both laugh and apologize to each other, and over the course of a few days, since we were both in the same workroom, we got to talking, and that local artist was my wonderful, beautiful wife, Annie, love of my life. I would not be where I am without her, I have to say. No one would even know what my name was without her. I call her my press secretary. And we were married 3 years later at the Marshall Center Community Gardens, where we had our first date. And she has been a very close companion with me on my woodworking journey as well. In 2016, when my piano rebuild business was starting to kind of stagnate and it wasn't really bringing me any joy anymore, she bought me my lathe, and I rediscovered my passion and love and skill for woodworking. And I have to say, working in the wood shop has taught me some very valuable lessons. Lesson number 1, don't put your finger there, stupid. Few other words that go along with that one: mindfulness and power tools. The first bowl I ever made has some of my blood in the wood because I got careless and distracted and had an accident which required 11 stitches and 8 weeks to heal. Yeah, that taught me, keep your mind on where you are and what you are doing. Lesson number 2, patience, patience, patience. I like to joke that there's a little gremlin that follows all blind people around, and when you drop something, they like to kick it so you can't find it. And sometimes they even steal it from you. I know my gremlin has a belt with a few of my tools in it. But it's also taught me you got to keep your cool. When I'm looking for that tool that I lost, it might take me a long time to find it, but if I don't keep my patience when I'm doing it, I will lose my mind. There's a quote by Bruce Lee that goes, patience is not passive. On the contrary, patience is concentrated strength. Lesson number 3, joy. Find the joy in life. There's so many times that I could have gotten mad or irritated at myself. For instance, when I forgot the lawnmower was at the bottom of the stairs and I tripped over it and did some midair acrobatics that I didn't really plan on. And when I was laying on the ground, the image of that went through my mind and I started laughing so hard I could hardly breathe. And it really helps you to get through life, to be able to just laugh at things. And lesson number 4, perseverance. You just got to keep on going. The second time I ever went out walking by myself, after I became blind, I was going over to a friend's house and I accidentally dropped my cane off of a bridge. And I stood there for a second and I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do now? And then, I'll walk in the gutter. Then I'll know where I am. And it's taught me if you can't do something one way, you can find another way to do it. Martin Luther King Jr. said, if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. And in my case, if you can't see, imagine. And I never could have imagined the life that I have now. And when I go out into my shop and I take an image that's in my mind and I create a real physical object, it makes me realize that I had to lose my sight to truly gain my vision. Thank you.